Some lies wear lace gloves, others sign their names in perfect ink. When a grieving widow arrives with a forged past and a will too polished to be true, the scent of deception reaches even the orchid-scented calm of West 35th Street. In this case, truth hides behind a smile and the signature that almost got away. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. The end of beer hour, as far as Wolfe was concerned, was sacred. It came with a predictability you could set your pulse to. At 6:45, he would raise his second glass, examine the clarity with the same scrutiny he gave rare orchids, and then sigh as though the day, for all its indignities, had at last redeemed itself. That evening was no different, until it was. I was halfway through the Gazette crossword, 4-letter word for evasive testimony, when Fritz's voice floated in, a little too tentative. "Sir, there is a visitor." Wolfe's eyes, which had been half closed in post-foam tranquility, opened like reluctant barn doors. "You were instructed," he said, "to permit no one." "Yes, sir, but she refuses to leave. She will not give her name." That earned her a look. From Wolfe, not Fritz. I started to rise, but Fritz added, "She says it concerns the last wishes of a dead man." That did it. Wolfe exhaled through his nose, reached for a linen napkin, and dabbed his mouth like a man preparing to attend a duel rather than a conversation. "Bring her," he said. "And Fritz, have you chilled the Amontillado?" She entered like she had rehearsed it. Black gloves, black hat, and a veil that just barely concealed the kind of cheekbones usually reserved for heirloom brooches. She walked to the red chair, my red chair, and sat without asking. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I am the widow of Edmund Varney." I didn't correct her on the seating chart. Wolfe had shifted in his chair just enough to indicate curiosity, but not so much that she'd think she had control of the room. She continued, voice composed but brittle around the edges. "I believe my husband's last wishes were deliberately concealed. A second will existed. It was written shortly before his death, but it has not been read." "Ah," Wolfe murmured. "And you presume it was suppressed?" "I do more than presume," she said, lifting her chin. Her voice had that cultivated softness that makes threats sound like compliments. Wolfe regarded her for a moment, then gestured to the brandy decanter, which she declined with a movement of the wrist. "I understand," she said. "You're thinking this is another squabble over inheritance. I assure you it's more dangerous than that." That's when I saw it, the tremble under the glove as she rested her hand on the armrest. Either it was grief, or she was hoping we wouldn't notice the difference. "You said a second will existed," Wolfe said. "Have you seen it?" "No," she answered, "but I know it was written. I know my husband summoned a notary and dictated it himself." Wolfe closed his eyes, the way a cat might when enduring a puppy's enthusiasm. "You base your claim, then, not on possession, but on hearsay." She didn't flinch. "He told me he had changed it, the night before his death." Wolfe let out a long, tired breath. "Mrs. Varney." "Miss," she corrected, and that earned her a fractional lift of the eyebrows from me. "Miss Varney," Wolfe resumed, "if I were to accept every claim brought to me by a disgruntled party to an estate, particularly one accompanied by zero documentation and a surfeit of personal grievance, I would require a separate filing cabinet simply for widows, wives, and women claiming both." She didn't answer, just stared. The veil, it turned out, was good for hiding expressions, but not tension. Wolfe glanced at me, but I held my tongue. For now, she was still playing cards she refused to show. "Miss Varney," Wolfe said with finality, "I decline." It wasn't a rebuke. It was a flat stone thrown into still water. Her answer was even flatter. "I expected as much." She stood, adjusted her gloves, and let the silence stretch. Wolfe had already reached for the orchid catalogue, a sign of disinterest more scathing than any dismissal. But she didn't leave. "I should mention," she said, "that someone else has already tried to interfere. Someone willing to kill over the will's contents." That earned her a pause. "Kill whom?" Wolfe asked, without looking up. She shrugged. "I don't know, but I believe it's why the original document vanished, and why my sister's life is now in danger." Her voice cracked, barely. Whether it was calculated or genuine, I wasn't ready to decide. She turned to go, then added, "You'll remember this moment, Mr. Wolfe, when you read the headlines." Wolfe made no reply. His fingers resumed thumbing the page, but his eyes had narrowed ever so slightly. She was halfway to the door when she stopped again. From her handbag, black patent leather, barely large enough for a pistol or a pardon, she withdrew a sealed envelope and placed it on Wolfe's desk. "It was meant for someone else," she said, "but it might help, if you change your mind." The envelope was thick, unmarked except for a single name written in fine, looping ink. Dominic Rayburn. Wolfe's brows lifted a fraction. I stepped closer but didn't touch it. I don't like handling stray correspondence until the air around it settles. "Who is Mr. Rayburn?" I asked. She offered a thin smile. "That, Mr. Goodwin, is something I'd hoped you could tell me." She turned and left without waiting for a response, the faint smell of violets trailing her like a question mark in perfume. I picked up the envelope, held it to the light. It wasn't perfumed. It was too heavy for that. Wolfe, still in his chair, hadn't moved. He said, "Do not open it." I wasn't planning to lick it. After Fritz shut the door behind her, the house held its breath. Wolfe didn't speak. Instead, he rose, deliberately, like an idea taking form, and walked to the plant room. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the fact that he didn't return. I waited 6 minutes. That's about 4 minutes longer than it takes to justify inertia. When he didn't reappear, I placed the envelope on the side table, poured myself 2 fingers of brandy, and sat where the widow had sat, just to see if the chair still held warmth. It didn't. "She's not the banker's widow," I said aloud, mostly to hear how it sounded. From the orchid room, Wolfe's voice came, low and precise. "Perhaps not, but whoever she is, she has already lied." I waited for more, but nothing followed, just the soft hiss of mist being released among roots that never lied and never blushed. The next morning, after a breakfast of Fritz's pear compote and Wolfe's uncharacteristic silence, I found myself summoned to the office with no more fanfare than a flick of the bell cord. "Archie," Wolfe said, without lifting his gaze from the orchid log, "you will proceed to Varney, Asher and Crane. Speak first with the senior partner, then the clerical staff. Inquire, without accusation, about the original testament and whether more than one was ever drafted." I asked if we were now representing the veiled lady. "We are not, but she has introduced a claim that requires dissection before I dismiss it entirely." "Dissection," he added, "not indulgence." That was Wolfe's version of opening a door halfway and daring the wind to prove it existed. I grabbed my coat. It was a grey Tuesday, the kind Manhattan uses to camouflage bureaucrats, bad architecture, and men who might or might not be senior partners in legacy law firms. By the time I reached the granite steps of Varney, Asher and Crane, I was ready to dissect something myself, preferably over scotch. The receptionist at Varney, Asher and Crane had the professional chill of a woman who could identify 3 types of cigar ash and make you feel inferior for all of them. She handed me off to a secretary, who passed me up a staircase and into the inner sanctum of one Mr. Asher, the sort of man who wore a suit so sharp it might have been cross-examined before breakfast. "Asher," he said, extending a hand precisely halfway across the desk. "You're with Mr. Wolfe." I confirmed the association and dropped the bait. "We're reviewing some inconsistencies surrounding Mr. Varney's estate. A client mentioned the possibility of an alternate will." "There is one valid will," he replied. Filed and probated. Sure, I said. But was another version ever drafted and delayed? His pen, platinum, engraved, not for you, amateurs, tapped once against his blotter. If it was, it no longer exists. Therefore, it is not germane, and I assure you, no such delay occurred with my knowledge. He smiled politely, with just enough stiffness to remind me that in this building, facts were filed, never discussed. I headed downstairs to the records department, where the air smelled like ink, dust, and ambition on a modest salary. A few minutes of loitering by the coffee machine earned me a nod from a thin young man with an unfortunate tie and an over-earnest paw. You handle the Varney drafts? I asked, offering him a donut from the cardboard box I'd liberated from the lobby. Yeah, he said. Typed most of them. Why? I took a slow sip of black coffee. I'm told there may have been another will. He hesitated, glanced toward the glass-panelled wall, then leaned in. There was. Now we were talking. Dictated 3 days before Mr. Varney passed. I typed it myself. He made a few changes by hand. Told me to hold the copy overnight. Said he'd return the next day to have it notarized. But he never came back. And the will, gone. I left it in a folder on my desk. Next morning, it was gone too. No copy. He shook his head. Never made one. I was told to hold it, not file it. I made a note on the inside of my brain and passed him another donut. Sometimes the sugar sticks better than the truth. I took him through the sequence again, slow and methodical, like I was testing the brakes on a new Packard. So he dictated a new will. You typed it, he left, you went home. Right. No witnesses, no backup. He nodded. And then? He shifted. Next morning I came in early. I figured I'd file a placeholder, but the draft was gone. I asked around, but nobody knew anything. I told Mr. Asher and was told to forget it. To forget it? He said Mr. Varney was entitled to reconsiderations, but unless something was signed and witnessed, it didn't exist. Which was true in the legal sense, but inconvenient truths often come wrapped in procedural ribbon. Still, I said, a missing document usually makes some noise. Not here, he said. Not if it's inconvenient. There was something else behind his eyes, but I let it hang. I'd found what I came for, and a little discomfort in a law office is more honest than a handshake. I rose to leave, tapping the last of the donut powder from my fingers, when the clerk cleared his throat, like a man about to sneeze something delicate. There's one more thing, he said. I probably shouldn't say it. Then it's probably worth hearing. He glanced around again. She called. The woman. Which woman? The one claiming to be Mrs. Varney. She called the office before the will reading. Okay. She asked if we'd be reading the new will. I paused. She used that word, new. This was before anything had been officially opened. That did it. She didn't seem surprised when I said I didn't know anything about it, just thanked me and hung up. I leaned a little closer. What name did she give? Just said she was Mrs. Varney, sounded composed, confident, not grieving. That was the kind of detail Wolfe would bite into like a cold chop. Thanks, I said. If you remember anything else, call my office. Or better yet, don't mention this to anyone. He gave me a thin nod, and I let the door swing behind me with just enough force to say the conversation was over. For now. Outside, the air had turned heavier, though the clouds hadn't moved. That's Manhattan logic for you. Weather stays put, but something in the sidewalk changes. I walked 4 blocks south before hailing a cab. Sometimes you need the rhythm of your own shoes to think straight. A second will typed and vanished. A veiled woman who knew more than she should have, and a senior partner who smiled like he'd been practicing in marble. It wasn't the sort of case Wolfe liked. Too much emotion, too many variables. But I knew something else about the man. He hated being manipulated, especially by someone who wore gloves indoors. By the time the cab pulled up to the brownstone, I had a theory. It smelled like silk and desperation. Fritz brought the beer on time. He always does. But Wolfe didn't raise his glass immediately. He waited for my full report, and I gave it to him, detail by starch-laced detail. When I got to the missing draft and the widow's premature inquiry, Wolfe finally picked up his glass, sipped, and gave a quiet "Umph." "She asked about the new will before it was known to exist," I said. "Sloppy or bold?" "Both," he replied, "which suggests she did not destroy it herself. A more competent fabricator would not have telegraphed so blatantly." "So who did?" He shook his head slightly. "Whoever stood to lose from its reading." I nodded. "That narrows it to anyone with a stake in the old will." "Precisely. The woman may be our catalyst, not our culprit." He took another sip. "Though she is certainly not innocent." "That much," I said. I picked up between the veil and the envelope. Wolfe sighed. "You will return to the firm tomorrow. This time, inquire about the firm's centennial gala. Who attended? Who gifted what?" I blinked. "You want me to ask about party favors?" "Among other things," he said. "Begin with the pens." And that, I had to admit, was Wolfe's idea of a cliffhanger. It takes a particular kind of charm to blend into a funeral without knowing the guest of honor. Fortunately, charm's a renewable resource in my line of work. The Varney service was held at Winther & Sons, a funeral home on the Upper East Side that made sorrow look expensive. I signed the register with the name Andrew Grice, which I borrowed from a short-lived chess columnist with bad posture and fewer friends. Nobody questioned it. The casket was closed, the flowers were abundant, and the mourners came in two speeds, hushed reverence and restrained calculation. I loitered in the back, sipping weak coffee and watching. One man stood out, a lanky fellow in a charcoal coat who kept glancing toward the side hallway, like he had somewhere else to be, but needed to prove he'd been here first. He didn't cry, didn't pray, and didn't sign the guest book. When he turned to leave, his eyes flicked once toward the daisies. Then he was gone, swift, like a man stepping off a sinking boat. I made a mental note to ask Fritz how many cousins Edmund Varney was known to possess. If there's one thing I've learned about grief arrangements, meaning flowers, not conspiracies, it's that the cards are rarely interesting. They're usually signed with love, in peace, or you'll be missed by people hoping the dead won't hold grudges. But one bouquet near the back wall had a card that stood out. A tall spray of white daisies, no ribbon, no sender, just a single ivory envelope folded into the stems, half concealed like it wanted to be caught. I pulled it gently, not enough to rattle the display. Inside, the card read, "For what you never forgave, R." No flourish, no second line. Just the dash and the initial, centered in tidy handwriting with a looped R that looked more like a brand than a name. I pocketed the card without folding it and gave the room one last survey. Nobody seemed to notice me lifting it, and nobody was hanging back anymore. Not even the man who hadn't signed. Whatever Varney hadn't forgiven, someone had remembered. I had a hunch Wolfe might forgive me for violating funeral etiquette if this turned into something worth more than chrysanthemums. The director, a slim man named Elliot with the complexion of chilled veal, caught me on my way out. I asked casually if he remembered who delivered the daisies. "I believe they were hand-delivered," he said, blinking as though recalling flower logistics was beneath his pay grade. "Arrived early this morning. No card from the shop, just that envelope. Very discreet." "Describe the man?" I asked. Elliot pursed his lips. "I never saw him. They were here when I opened. One of the interns might have received them." "Intern got a name?" "No," he said. "They rotate." I thanked him with a handshake that lasted just long enough to make him uncomfortable and stepped into the cooler air. No name, no florist stamp, no witnesses, just a spray of daisies and a cryptic note signed R. It might have been a gesture of guilt, or a warning, or a calling card. It wasn't much, but in Wolfe's world, one well-written letter often outweighed a room full of silence. There are a dozen flower shops within walking distance of Winther & Sons, but only one of them still used real ink on their delivery slips and knew how to spell Lysianthus without flinching. Riley's on 72nd. I stepped in and was greeted by the smell of cut stems and vague regret. The counter clerk was a redhead with freckles and a Harvard sweatshirt that didn't match the rest of her uniform. "Afternoon," I said. "I'm trying to track a delivery from this morning. Tall, white daisies. No shop card, envelope tucked into the stems." She nodded. "Yeah, that guy asked me for a pen. Said he needed to write something personal." "What guy?" She tilted her head. "Older. Silver hair, grey overcoat, cufflinks." "Cufflinks? Big ones, silver, with a tree or a torch or something on them." That narrowed it down to either a foreign diplomat or someone who missed the 1930s. "He pay with a card?" "Cash." Of course he did. "Anything else?" She sniffed. "He smelled like my grandfather's cologne, real strong, kind of spicy, old-fashioned." I thanked her. One letter, one R, and now one ghost who wore silver on his sleeves and left no trace but a memory of scent. Before leaving Riley's, I pulled the card from my pocket and slid it across the counter. "Mind if I ask something else?" The redhead studied it, tilted her head. "That's the card he wrote." "You're sure?" She shrugged. "I watched him write it." "Recognize the handwriting?" She frowned. "Kind of. We did Mr. Varney's holiday arrangements for the last few years. Poinsettias, wreaths, some ugly pine thing for his law office." "And?" "I remember he used to sign the delivery tags himself. He liked his own script." She held the card closer. "Looks like his writing. Same capital R, same weird underline." Which meant either someone was copying a dead man's hand, or he hadn't been quite as dead as advertised when the card was written. I left the florist with 2 leads and a deeper chill than I'd picked up outside. There's a difference between impersonating a man and writing like him, and if the ink matched the grave, someone was keeping souvenirs. I headed south toward E68th, where I knew a couple of cab stands shared the flower delivery trade like bootleggers divvying corners. After a few smiles and a folded $5, I got a lead from a man named Gus, who chewed spearmint like it owed him money. "Yeah, I had a silver hair, long coat, smelled like he stepped out of a piano bar in 1940. "Drop off?" "Riley's Flowers, about 9:15. "Pickup location?" He scratched his cheek. "Didn't ask. Just waved me over on Lex." "Where'd he go after?" "Gave me cash, told me to head east toward the river. Said I could drop him anywhere near the docks." "Which docks?" Gus shrugged. "Didn't matter. He got out near Pier 17. Walked off like he'd done it before." That narrowed the list to about 100 crumbling warehouses and 3 miles of unanswered questions. If ghosts hailed cabs, this one preferred the East River to a séance. I paid Gus, tipped my hat, and walked west. Wolfe would want every detail, including the cabbie's gum. By the time I reached the brownstone, I'd walked off most of the sidewalk grime and at least half the mystery, but none of the irritation. The front door opened before I rang. Fritz greeted me with his usual polite urgency. "Mr. Goodwin, a visitor came during your absence." "Name?" He declined to give one. "Description?" "Tall, grey hair, distinct cologne." I didn't need to hear more, but he continued. "He said he was Mr. Varney's cousin." "Did he sit?" Fritz shook his head. "Refused. Said he wouldn't be long. Left this." He handed me a folded card, blank on one side, embossed initials DR on the other. No note, no contact. "He refused refreshments?" I asked. "He asked for silence and left within 2 minutes. Wolfe was still upstairs with his orchids. I decided not to disturb him until the timing was right. Cousins, ghosts, and cards signed by dead men. Either Mr. R had developed a flair for posthumous correspondence, or someone was impersonating the afterlife for reasons yet unstated. And I had a feeling Wolfe would want more than just initials the next time our visitor dropped by. Wolfe does not eat dinner in the kitchen. That's not a theory, it's a doctrine, and like most doctrines in the brownstone, it's observed with the rigidity of monastic law. So when he asked Fritz, at precisely 7:18 p.m., to set 2 places at the kitchen table and prepare oysters with Amontillado, I nearly checked his temperature. Fritz blinked but said nothing. He never does when reality takes an unseasoned turn. I followed Wolfe into the kitchen without a word, mostly because I was too busy cataloguing anomalies. No dinner jacket, no orchids, no lecture on oysters as aesthetic artifacts. Just Wolfe, a linen napkin, and a placid request for food, as if he were, God forbid, merely hungry. He took the seat nearest the spice rack and poured himself a sherry while Fritz arranged the silver. I took the other chair, not because I was invited, but because Wolfe didn't stop me. "He will not introduce himself," Wolfe said, adjusting the glass slightly, "and you are not to press him." I nodded, filed that under unusual, and waited for the guest who had managed to alter Wolfe's ritual without being in the room. He arrived precisely at 7:31, escorted by Fritz with the faint look of a man showing a tiger to a piano recital. Wolfe didn't rise. I stood, out of reflex or respect, I wasn't sure which. The man was tall, lean, and tailored like he came from a time when tailors didn't use tape measures. His suit was charcoal, his shoes polished to the point of irony, and his gloves, black leather, remained on as he took the offered seat. "Thank you," he said, voice smooth, clipped, and regionless. "I won't be long." He made no move to remove his gloves or coat. His eyes, grey or blue, depending on the angle, flicked once around the kitchen, resting briefly on the orchids near the window. "You have an unusual dining room," he added. "This is not our dining room," Wolfe replied. "It is where we conduct interviews when the interviewee does not warrant the office." The man smiled slightly. "Understood." Wolfe did not smile. There was no introduction, none offered, none asked for. I tucked my notepad under the napkin and watched. Wolfe poured sherry. Mr. R declined. He wasn't there to drink. He was there to see how far a certain kind of money could go. He reached into his coat with the precision of a surgeon and placed a long, white envelope on the table between them. It made a whispering sound on the linen, which I found more unnerving than a slap. 5,000, he said, in unmarked recent bills. Wolfe regarded the envelope as though it might be infected. "And what precisely do you expect in return?" "Abandonment," Mr. R said, "of the matter involving Miss Varney and her suppositions." "Suppositions?" Wolfe echoed. "She has misinterpreted events, as grieving women sometimes do. I'm sure you understand." "I understand grief," Wolfe said, "and the uses to which it is put." The man didn't flinch. "You are a private consultant. This is a private inducement. There will be no mention, no regret, and no further disturbance to anyone living or dead." He said, living or dead, as if he considered them morally interchangeable. I didn't speak. Wolfe didn't blink. Mr. R leaned back, resting one gloved hand on the envelope. "It's a generous offer, especially for doing nothing." Wolfe exhaled lightly. "The problem, sir, is that I never do nothing. Even when I decline to act, it is a conscious exercise of will." The man's smile remained fixed. "That envelope contains an expression of will." "So does fire," Wolfe said. Wolfe tapped the base of his glass twice with his index finger, which, in the house of Wolfe, was a declaration of contempt. "I have received bribes before," he said. "Some artful, some clumsy. Yours is notable for its neatness, not its subtlety." Mr. R spread his fingers slowly. "There is no malice, only expedience." Wolfe's voice cooled. "Ubi mel, ibi fel." Mr. R raised an eyebrow. "It means, where there is honey, there is also gall." "Latin," the man said. "A Roman once said it to a woman who offered him favor wrapped in diplomacy." "Did he accept?" "He did not," Wolfe said, "and the empire endured another century." The envelope remained on the table, untouched. Mr. R's smile thinned by a fraction. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. On the contrary, Wolfe replied. I'm clarifying it. You wish to erase a pursuit with currency, but pursuit implies motive. If you know mine, state it. Curiosity, said the man. Wolfe nodded. And you fear curiosity. That, I find, is its own confession. I stayed quiet, which Wolfe would have taken as a miracle under other circumstances. But my attention was occupied elsewhere, by cufflinks. Silver, monogrammed, the letter R woven into a looping vine. I didn't recognize the design, but it looked custom, not catalogue. He hadn't touched his napkin. That mattered too. Wolfe always notices what a man refuses, not what he accepts. When Wolfe mentioned the word will, the man's left hand twitched. Just a flicker, a hesitation on the rim of his glass. His lips didn't move, but the rhythm of his breath changed, slightly faster for the span of one inhale. I watched, memorized, filed. Wolfe leaned back, his posture still statuesque. You are wasting your evening. The man didn't rise. He studied Wolfe like one predator sizing another, but it was Wolfe who had the den, the lair, and the teeth. The envelope remained between them, ignored now, the way you ignore a cigarette burn on silk you can't afford to replace. When Mr. R finally moved, it was slow and smooth, and that was when Wolfe inhaled. Wolfe's nose is not the average nose. It is a barometer, a courtroom, and sometimes, I think, a loaded gun. He didn't speak until the man had crossed the threshold into the hall. Then he breathed in, once, and murmured, Nuit de l'homme. I raised an eyebrow. Bless you. A cologne, he said, by Yves Saint Laurent, reformulated in 2011, discontinued in 2019. I looked toward the door. So? It's distinctive, Wolfe continued. Notes of cardamom, cedar, bergamot, easily masked by cheaper imitations, but unmistakable in original form. You're saying that was the real stuff? Yes. Discontinued 3 years ago. Correct. Varney died 2 years ago. Wolfe's eyes met mine. And this man smells like he's been dead longer than the banker. I whistled low, meaning either he hoards vintage cologne or, Wolfe said softly, he's not new to this game. He turned his head slightly. Note the envelope. Untouched. That was not a bribe. It was an erasure. I didn't answer. For once, the kitchen smelled more like memory than food. And Wolfe, who usually saved his nose for sauces and frauds, was already reaching for the envelope to burn it with words instead of flame. After Wolfe left the kitchen, presumably to resume orchid communion or recite invective in Latin, I stayed put. The envelope sat there, all $5,000 of it, like a dead goldfish no one wanted to bury. I took out my notebook, flipped to a fresh page, and jotted a single acronym, NDLH. I underlined it twice and added, Cologne confirmed, discontinued, either a ghost or a very sentimental killer. I didn't need Wolfe to tell me this visit had shifted the axis. Our man wasn't some garden variety thug with designer instincts. He had poise, vocabulary, and a scent profile too clean for coincidence. I leaned forward, tapped the cufflink impression he'd left in the napkin's fold, and made a mental sketch. The napkin was still untouched. That, too, was a kind of signature. Then I added a final line to my notes. Even ghosts know where Wolfe eats. They just can't finish the oysters. Fritz entered to clear the table, but I stopped him. Leave that napkin, I said. Wolfe may want to sniff it again. And if he didn't, I would. Because in this house, even linen could testify. The next morning, after a night of silence, Wolfe pretended not to notice. I made the obligatory call to Miss Varney's residence. I wasn't expecting a warm greeting, but I wasn't expecting what I got either. The line clicked after the second ring. A female voice, younger than the widow and sharper than any maid I've met, answered with a cautious, yes? I gave my name and stated my intention, Just a routine check-in for a client Wolfe had not yet agreed to take. "She's not fit to speak," the voice snapped. "Then maybe you can—" Click. Not a soft click either. The kind that says someone doesn't care whether you call back, because they won't be picking up if you do. I stared at the receiver for a moment, then hung it up and gave Wolfe the update. "She's grieving," he said dryly, "or preparing for a performance." I wasn't sure which one disturbed him more. I decided to pay her a visit. Wolfe didn't object, which, in brownstone terms, counts as enthusiastic encouragement. Miss Varney lived in a narrow townhouse off Gramercy Park, the kind that hadn't been repainted since Asta stopped throwing parties. A maid let me in with minimal expression and led me up 2 flights to a parlour with drawn curtains and the perfume of lilies battling yesterday's cigarettes. She was in a pale blue silk robe, curled on a settee like grief had melted her spine. Her eyes were ringed with mascara that had clearly surrendered hours ago. "She's dead," she said, without waiting for me to sit. I waited. "My sister, Eva. She was driving back from Stamford, skidded off the road near New Canaan. They say it was the rain." I offered condolences with the appropriate softness, but I was also watching her hands, steady on the teacup, not shaking, not clenched. "Eva was the only person who knew everything," she whispered. That would have hit harder if I didn't already suspect she meant it literally. Still, there's a line between acting and mourning. This time, it was drawn in mascara. I let a respectable pause stretch between the condolences and the questions. Wolfe trained me well on tempo. When the air was heavy enough, I leaned in a notch. "I'm sorry to press," I said, "but I wanted to follow up on something. A man visited us last night. Grey suit, silver cufflinks, smelled like memories. Said nothing helpful, except that we should drop the case." Her brows lifted. "What case?" "The one you brought us." She looked blank, carefully blank. "I don't understand." "He offered Wolfe money. $5,000 to walk away from your story about the second will." She blinked twice. No tears, just the reflex. "I never asked you to investigate. You left an envelope on Wolfe's desk." She hesitated. "That was just a lead, something I couldn't follow." "And your call to the law office, asking about the new will?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, eyes falling to the carpet like she'd dropped a pearl. "Eva handled the calls," she said. That might have passed, if she hadn't just told me Eva was driving home when it happened. I let the silence stretch, but she didn't blink. Instead, she reached for a tissue, dabbed at a non-existent tear, and then folded it neatly, like she was rehearsing regret. "I remember Edmund mentioning the second will," she said finally. "He said he was revising some terms, but I wasn't involved." "You never saw it?" "No." "He didn't ask your opinion?" "No." I gave her a little head tilt, the kind that says I'm listening, but you're not helping. "Look," she said, eyes flashing just briefly. I wanted to believe he would be fair, that he would remember what we shared. But I was just the woman beside him, not the woman on paper. That line was too polished, not rehearsed, engraved. "I wasn't asking for anything," she added, sniffing. "Just the truth. Another tissue, another fold. It's a funny thing. Grief makes people forget." But she remembered every line of that monologue. She reached into her handbag, something sleek and black, with a clasp shaped like a snake's head, presumably for another tissue. What came out first was a white linen napkin, crisply folded but creased like it had been handled more than once. It fluttered to the floor near my shoe. I bent to retrieve it, and my eye caught something along the lower edge. A faint blot of black ink, and just beside it, a looping initial. J. I held it in my hand longer than etiquette demanded. Linen, restaurant quality, stitched edge, no monogram. But the ink stood out, not smeared, not accidental, written perhaps. She didn't react until I handed it over. "Oh," she said. "That must have been from dinner with Eva. We had sushi last week." I looked at the ink. Sushi and fountain pens? She laughed weakly. She was writing notes. I don't know. It was a strange night. It had just gotten stranger. If you believe in coincidence, you'd say it was just a napkin. But I'd seen the banker's signature once before, and I don't believe in ghosts with good penmanship. She reached for the napkin again, but I kept it just a second longer. Wolfe always says that handwriting is the shadow of thought. I'd add that ink doesn't lie, even when people do. The looped J was familiar. Not just familiar, precise. Same flourish, same pressure, same peculiar lean left on the vertical. I'd seen it on the holiday checks Wolfe had shown me, signed J. Edmund Varney. What did she write? I asked, watching her face. I told you, she said too quickly. Just notes, names. Did the banker ever sign things in the house? Her pause was too long. I mean, in front of you, I added. Of course, she said. He signed everything. On napkins. She exhaled, just slightly. Once, at a restaurant, he forgot a card, so he wrote his name for the maitre d'. It was charming. Charming wasn't the word Wolfe would have used. I handed her the napkin. She tucked it away without a glance. Sometimes people over-explain truth. But lies come gift-wrapped in anecdotes. Outside, the air had turned humid, and the clouds were building something unpleasant above the rooftops. I loosened my tie and walked slowly, trying not to think too hard, which guaranteed I did. She looked like grief, spoke like grief, but the lines were too well shaped, the pauses too elegantly timed. Eva was dead, the banker was dead, and now a napkin with his handwriting had fluttered out of a purse on cue, with just enough ink to stir suspicion, but not enough to print a confession. Grief, real or not, doesn't usually carry props. I turned down 2nd Avenue, the kind of block where anonymity gets served by the cup, and flagged a cab back to the brownstone. Wolfe would want the details, and he'd want them in order. But even he would have to admit, if this woman was lying, she wasn't doing it alone. And if she was telling the truth, well, the truth was wearing too much makeup. It's a rare thing for Fritz to bypass protocol, especially when it comes to the sanctity of the front door. The bell had barely finished its second chime when I heard a bark, not from Wolfe, but from Fritz, sharp and foreign to the civilized air of the brownstone. That was my only warning before the vestibule trembled under the weight of Inspector Kramer, red-faced, shoulders glistening from what had clearly been a recent tango with the weather. He didn't wait to be invited in. Wolfe, he said, planting himself just inside the threshold like a man declaring war on upholstery. We've got a dead man, and your boy, he has got his fingerprints all over the air. Fritz cleared his throat as if he'd been slighted in 3 languages. Wolfe, from his throne behind the desk, merely raised one eyebrow. I stayed seated, but my notebook slid into my pocket without needing to be asked. Kramer slapped a manila folder on the edge of Wolfe's desk with the tender affection of a man tossing raw meat to a lion. Male, mid-30s, brown hair, blue eyes, no ID, fractured skull, and enough river muck in his lungs to float a barge. Pulled out of the East River just before sunrise. Sound familiar? Wolfe tilted his head, not unlike a botanist inspecting rot on a leaf. Kramer jabbed a finger toward me. Your boy here described a cousin visiting late last week. That cousin had the same build, same voice, same stupid suede jacket with brass buttons, and now he's bobbing dockside with a skull fracture and a ticket to Bellevue's cold closet. I opened my mouth. Wolfe beat me to it. Spare us the theatrical staging, Inspector. If this is your version of evidence, it lacks vigor. Kramer's jaw moved, but words came slowly. You want to explain how someone visits this place and ends up dead 3 days later with no name? I suggest, Wolfe said, you look where names are erased, not where they're offered. Rather than answer, Wolfe stood. It was not a gesture of submission. It was what I called his vertical rejection. He moved to the sideboard, opened the cabinet with the delicacy reserved for both brandy and enlightenment, and poured 2 fingers into a glass. Are you drinking to the dead man? Kramer asked. I am drinking, Wolfe replied. To clarity. You may choose your own toasts. You smug son of… Language, Wolfe warned mildly. This is not your precinct. It is my home. He took a measured sip, then lowered himself back into his chair with the sigh of a man reclaiming his rightful altitude. You're obstructing, Kramer growled. That's what this is. Obstruction. I have yet to obstruct, Inspector. You arrived uninvited, brought a corpse, and I, graciously, listened. That is not obstruction. That is patience. Kramer leaned in. Don't test me, Wolfe. I've had a wet morning and no patience for your Latin. Then perhaps, Wolfe said, you ought to have stayed dry. Kramer switched targets like a man changing bait. His eyes landed on me. You kept notes, Goodwin. Always, I said. Then hand 'em over. I looked at Wolfe. He didn't blink. No. That wasn't a question, Kramer barked. It was poorly disguised as one, Wolfe said. Mr. Goodwin's notes are the product of a privileged engagement. He's not a damn priest. No, Wolfe agreed. He is not. He is an agent in my employ, and those notes are the equivalent of legal counsel. Cut the crap, Wolfe. I would if I could, Inspector. But alas, the law has long been your second language, and you've yet to master the grammar. Kramer stepped forward, nostrils flaring. You really want to do this the hard way? It is not I who makes things difficult. It is language, and your tenuous grasp of it. I didn't move. My notebook stayed put. And the tension in the room thickened like sauce left unattended on Fritz's stove. Wolfe shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting the tilt of his bulk with a grace that would never be called graceful. Then he murmured, almost to the fireplace, a hint of Nuit de l'Homme. Curious. Kramer narrowed his eyes. What? The deceased. You said he wore a suede jacket. Cologne clings to suede, and that particular fragrance is rare, unmistakably French, with notes of vetiver and ambroxan. Kramer blinked. So? So it was not available in domestic shops until 2 years ago, and it retails at a price that discourages casual affection. You're saying this guy was European? I said nothing of the sort, Wolfe replied, now mildly amused. I said he wore something expensive. You leapt continents. Kramer sniffed at the bait and lunged. You know something. You knew who he was. Wolfe sighed. No, Inspector. I was speaking figuratively. You were… what? Metaphor, sir. A tool of rhetoric. You should try it. Less bludgeon, more blade. Kramer grunted. Next time, try speaking English. I do. You simply listen in dialect. Kramer stood, gathering his paperwork like a man scraping scraps from a losing poker hand. He paused at the edge of the carpet, visibly calculating the number of words left in his threat inventory. I'll be back, he muttered. Indeed, Wolfe replied. Then, just as Kramer turned, Wolfe added, There were 3 wills, you know. Kramer stopped. What? 3 drafts, only one was valid. But regrettably, it was never read. Kramer's jaw moved again. You saying this was about money? I said nothing of the kind. I merely observed a fact. You're playing games. No, Inspector. You are. But you've misread the board. That did it. Kramer barked a frustrated breath and stormed out without another syllable. The front door offered a final punctuation mark as it shut with authority and indignation. Wolfe reached for his glass again, untouched since the first sip. 3 wills, I echoed. Yes, Wolfe said, and only one truth. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. When the silence settled, it did so like dust in a cathedral, slow, soft, but unmistakably sacred. I didn't speak. Wolfe didn't move. The fire ticked quietly in the grate. Fritz's steps receded toward the kitchen with the same discretion he'd been born into. I remained in the red chair, legs crossed, notebook still sealed in my jacket. Wolfe's gaze was aimed at the hearth, but I've lived with him long enough to know when it's the fire he's staring at and when it's something else entirely. This was the latter. He didn't ask for more beer. He didn't mention lunch. His fingers tapped once on the armrest. 1, 2, 3, then went still. I waited, because if there's one thing Nero Wolfe does better than anyone alive, it's think. And when Wolfe thinks in silence, the rest of us do well to let the air listen with us. It was a Miltoniopsis vexillaria morning, which in Wolfe's world means absolute silence, unless fire or bloodshed qualifies for interruption. I was on page 3 of the Gazette, nursing the remains of my second coffee, when Wolfe, fingers deep in a nest of pink and white petals, said, "The napkin, Mr. Goodwin." He hadn't looked at me. The orchid got his full attention. I retrieved the infamous square of linen from the document tray and handed it over. He turned it delicately, as though it might bruise. "Royal blue," he murmured. "Mont Blanc." "Which tells us," I asked, "that someone is living in the past, or pretending to." I raised a brow. "That stuff's still around." He sniffed. "Discontinued 5 years ago. This hue," he angled the napkin toward the light, "was exclusive to a custom run. I recall it because the commission was rather vulgar." "That narrows it down to half the bankers in Manhattan," I offered. He shook his head once. "Only one had a gala." Wolfe abandoned the orchid for the sanctity of his desk and shut the drawer with the precision of a man sealing a verdict. Mont Blanc was prevailed upon to manufacture a batch of royal blue for a single client, he began. It was during the centennial gala of the Salton Trust. The board gifted custom pens to each executive. He tapped a finger on the napkin. One of them, evidently, has survived both time and taste. I dropped into my chair. "You want me to go knock on bank doors, asking who's been hoarding obsolete ink?" "No," he said. "That would be idiotic." "Then I'm relieved." "You will go," Wolfe said slowly, "to the widow's apartment." I blinked. "To do what? Offer her another tissue?" "To examine her possessions for such a pen," Wolfe replied. "She will not have discarded it. Sentiment rarely permits the erasure of trophies." "Trophies?" His mouth curled slightly. "You'll understand soon enough. Take gloves." I phoned ahead, keeping my tone suitably muted, and asked if I might stop by with a few clarifying questions for the file. She sounded distracted, but agreed. When I got there, she was wrapped in a cardigan and sipping something from a thin-lipped porcelain cup. She looked like a woman who hadn't cried, but knew how to appear as though she had. We sat. I offered a few solemn nods and said Wolfe needed to confirm the banker's left-handedness against the angle of the signature. It was a fine piece of hokum, and it worked like chamomile. She nodded and went off to fetch an album. While she rummaged, I did the opposite. The study door was ajar. I stepped inside and gave it the kind of scan that would make a TSA agent proud. Second drawer, walnut desk. There it was. Matte, black Mont Blanc, thin gold trim, capped and nestled between a stapler and a photo frame. The photo caught me harder than the pen. It was a wedding portrait, she in lace, him not the banker, and a smile that didn't match her tears. You get used to faces in this line of work. Some lie, some bluff, and some are puzzles waiting to be solved. The man beside the widow had the kind of jaw that looked better in silence, and hair parted with military precision. Not the banker, no, not even close. But he did ring a bell. Specifically, the florist's. Back at the shop, that woman had described a man who came to sign the sympathy card with the initials R. Dark hair, slim nose, left-handed. This guy fit the profile like a glove sewn inside out. Off just enough to question, close enough to nag. I slipped the pen into my coat pocket with a tissue wrapped around it, call it forensic courtesy, and made a polite retreat just as the widow reappeared with her album. I thanked her, feigned interest in a black and white baby photo, and left her staring out the window as if expecting someone to arrive. My bet, he already had. Wolfe didn't speak for a full 5 minutes after I handed him the pen and described the photo. He unscrewed the cap as if diffusing a mine, then touched the nib to a sliver of filter paper from the lab drawer. "Compare," he instructed, gesturing toward the napkin stain. The paper took the ink in a slow bloom. Wolfe brought over the napkin, still crisp from its night in the freezer, and aligned the blotches like a jeweler comparing diamonds. He grunted. Same solvent base, same inconsistency in the blue's oxidization. This ink came from that pen and no other. Which ties her to the napkin, I said. Wolfe inclined his head. Not ties, binds. She had the pen, the ink, the motive, and, evidently, the signature. And the man in the photo? He sat. Find him. Living or dead? Wolfe's brow arched. Preferably the former, but if deceased, his burial site may prove instructive. I jotted it down. Wolfe, for all his loathing of physical motion, had a way of sending me out like a chess piece. The orchids had returned, fresh cut and annoyingly smug in their water trays. Wolfe, restored to his favourite chair, sipped beer with the patience of a man watching fools dance on distant rooftops. Even orchids, he said, can present as one thing and be another. Hybrids abound, Mr. Goodwin. So do forgeries. I nodded. You want vital records? Yes. The man in the photograph. I want to know where he was born, if he married, to whom, and, if Providence allows, where he lies buried. You expect he's dead? I expect nothing. I investigate. Where do I start? He closed his eyes. Social security records, newspaper archives, cemetery registries. You're literate. Begin. And the widow. He waved a hand. A moth, circling its own illusion. She deceived herself first. The rest followed naturally. I headed for the coat rack. That's how it goes with Wolfe. Deep philosophy, followed by legwork. By nightfall, I had a list of 3 possible names from birth announcements and 2 from marriage licenses. None matched the banker. One matched the man in the photograph. Wolfe read silently, finger tapping his cheek in rhythm with his thoughts. Finally, he said, "She was never a widow." I frowned. "You mean legally?" "No," he said, "existentially." He pushed back from the desk. Her grief was performative, her deception, meticulous. But her eyes, Mr. Goodwin, her eyes betrayed calculation, not loss. Then who was he to her? A mark, a convenience, perhaps even a co-conspirator, though I doubt she expected permanence. I leaned back. So she wasn't mourning him? No, Wolfe said. She was mourning the collapse of a strategy and fearing the exposure of its architect. There was a long pause as he poured the last of the beer. Even predators, he said softly, occasionally grieve the trap they built for themselves. And that, I knew, meant the next move was mine. The afternoon had the texture of parchment, thick with stillness and ready for ink. Wolfe rang the bell, not for beer, but for me. That alone was suspicious. "Paper," he said. I grabbed a pad from the side drawer and set myself up at my desk. Wolfe adjusted his cuffs, leaned back, and closed his eyes, not to rest, but to summon the ghosts of deduction. "I am ready," he said, "to reconstruct her scheme." "No warm-up?" I asked. "No lecture on human folly?" He waved a hand. "She has already provided it through her conduct. We begin in South America." I poised my pen. "Geography, that's a good opener." "Geography is always good," Wolfe replied. "It limits imagination." He opened his eyes, which had that particular glow they get before a full unraveling. The kind that makes you wonder if he's seeing people, motives, or merely dust motes rearranging themselves into truth. "5 years ago," he began, "our widow was no widow at all." "Her name then," Wolfe continued, "was not Varney, nor any variation thereof. She travelled under an alias, Elena Rios, I believe. She secured employment in Buenos Aires as a private nurse. It was a logical choice. Nursing allows proximity, discretion, and access to both medicine and men. I scribbled. "And she met the banker there?" "Indeed. Mr. Edmund Varney, attending the centennial of the bank's South American branch. He was wealthy, lonely, and beginning to decay in the moral sense that invites rescue or manipulation. She offered both, I said. Wolfe inclined his head. He succumbed with alacrity. She was skillful, patient, and above all, adaptive. She learned his tastes, his vices, and his penmanship. Their companionship soon extended beyond the prescribed duties of convalescence. In plain English, I said, she danced him into love. Love, Wolfe muttered, is merely trust-wearing rouge. He trusted her completely, and she, Mr. Goodwin, began to choreograph a tango that has not yet ended. Wolfe lifted a hand. Within a year, she arranged what the press would later term a private ceremony. The banker, sentimental but cautious, married her in name only. There were no legal filings in the United States, merely a notarized letter in Spanish, conveniently unverifiable, outside Argentina. I frowned. So she wasn't his wife. She was what she needed to be, Wolfe said. In Buenos Aires, a spouse. In New York, a nurse. The fluidity of identity is the criminal's most efficient solvent. Her real husband? I prompted. Wolfe nodded. Still alive, traveling under yet another alias and functioning as her accomplice. Together, they cultivated the fiction of her widowhood while maintaining their separate roles, he as intermediary, she as caretaker. It was the perfect arrangement, proximity to wealth without the inconvenience of inheritance law. Until the banker caught on? Until he decided, Wolfe corrected, to rewrite his will. That, naturally, required his removal, preferably by grief, not violence. Wolfe's voice had the quiet satisfaction of a man savouring his own proof. Our Lady began rehearsing widowhood long before the banker's demise. Socially, she wore mourning black. Financially, she transferred small assets under the guise of preparations. Emotionally, she wept for a man still taking his breakfast. Efficient, I said. She was a virtuoso, Wolfe replied. When the banker suffered his final collapse, helped perhaps by a stimulant or an omission, she was already the widow in the eyes of polite society. It required only one false document, a few altered signatures, and a well-timed performance of despair. I tapped my pen. And the will? She ensured the new one never surfaced. Only the earlier favourable version appeared. Yet she knew a second copy existed, hence her little visit here, pretending to seek truth when she was merely verifying what had gone missing. Smart, I said. Not smart enough, Wolfe murmured. Her cleverness was chronological, not moral. Wolfe gestured toward the discarded envelope still resting on his desk. Her true quarry was not sentiment. It was property. Specifically, the banker's estate, his townhouse, his stocks, his collection of manuscripts. To secure them, she needed not legitimacy, but delay. Delay? I asked. Yes, long enough for the real heirs to vanish under suspicion or death. I frowned. You mean the cousin? Precisely, the cousin who came calling at this very house. He was a man of inconvenient conscience. She could not risk his testimony or his existence. His murder, disguised as a river accident, completed the tableau. She forged the signature on the last will, I said. Wolfe nodded. Using ink from the Mont Blanc pen, a forgery impeccable to the eye but betrayed by chemistry. That napkin was her practice sheet, a rehearsal in fraud. I leaned back. She rehearsed widowhood, forgery, and mourning. Wolfe sipped his beer. And now she will rehearse defence. Wolfe folded his hands, closing the circle. The irony, Mr. Goodwin, is exquisite. The true Mrs. Edmund Varney, the banker's lawful wife, remains alive. Her whereabouts were easy enough to trace once we examined the Hartford property records. She lives quietly under her maiden name, in a farmhouse north of the river. Alive and uninformed? I asked. Alive and indifferent, Wolfe said. She left him years ago, took no part in his affairs, and had no reason to contest what she presumed was his solitude. That indifference permitted the imposter's play. Then she's the only innocent in this carnival, I said. Perhaps, Wolfe replied. But innocence is rarely profitable. It merely survives. He reached for another bottle of beer. For now. I shut my notebook, letting the last line rest like a period on a tombstone. So, I said, we've got a widow who buried a man she never married, forged a will she couldn't cash, and cried over a fortune that isn't hers. Wolfe's eyelids drooped. A satisfactory summary. Not for her, I said. He exhaled, deep and final. Few epitaphs are. I leaned back, stretching. Still, I'll say this. When it comes to women with imagination, this one wrote her own obituary. Wolfe didn't answer. He didn't have to. When Inspector Kramer offered to drive, I assumed the end was near, either for the case or for me. Riding shotgun in a federal sedan with Manhattan's least cuddly cop wasn't on my bucket list, but the man had a license and a motive. Wolfe had delivered one of his pronouncements, and it pointed north, specifically to a farmhouse in the Connecticut hills where, according to Wolfe, the real Mrs. Edmund Varney had taken her talents for invisibility. Kramer drove like he interrogated, direct and without mercy. We said little until the trees thickened and the GPS got nervous. When we finally bumped down the gravel driveway, a woman was already on the porch. She didn't rise, just folded her hands on her lap and watched the car stop. Silver hair, clear eyes, and the kind of stillness you find in people who've made up their mind about the world. Kramer muttered something that wasn't printable. I opened the door and stepped out first. Mrs. Varney? She nodded, then added, That's a name I haven't used in a long time. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't need to. She invited us inside with the kind of grace that makes you check for knives later. The farmhouse smelled faintly of lavender and discipline. She served tea, without asking if we wanted any, and waited until the cups were poured before speaking. I was his wife, she said. Legally, inconveniently. But I left him 12 years ago. It was mutual, a gentleman's truce, you might say. Kramer shifted in his chair like it owed him money. You're saying you had no interest in his estate? She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I had no interest in the man. He was always playing games. Business, marriage, morality. It was all chess to him. He enjoyed watching people move, especially when they didn't know they were pieces. I glanced at Kramer. He didn't write it down, but he heard it. She turned to me. He said, if things turned ugly, I was to speak only to Mr. Wolfe. Not the police, not the papers, just Nero Wolfe. She stood, crossed the room without a sound, and opened a drawer that had the dust pattern of something untouched for years. What she retrieved was a letter. Yellowed, sealed, addressed in a sharp, angular script I'd seen once before. On a ledger in a banker's study where nobody was breathing. She placed it in my hand. He wrote it 4 years ago. Said if anything happened, anything clever, dangerous or fatal, I'd know it by the smell of it. And then I'd give this to Mr. Wolfe's man. Smells about right, I said. Kramer took a step forward, but she shook her head. It's not for the police. It's not evidence. It's instruction. I tucked it inside my coat. It was light, but it felt heavier than a confession. Outside, the wind picked up through the pines, as if even nature was done with secrets. She added softly, it tells you where the real will is, and why he never wanted it found too soon. Before we left, she handed me 3 more things, each wrapped in silence. First, a brass key with tarnish along the teeth. To his study drawer, she said, the bottom one on the left. Next came a folded paper, hand-drawn floor plan of the Varney townhouse, annotated in pencil. The kind of map that tells you not just where to walk, but where to stop thinking like a civilian. Finally, her hand lingered a moment longer before placing the 3rd item in mine. A warning. He didn't believe in heirs, she said. He believed in conclusions, tidy ones. He called it his legacy of endings. Kramer gave a grunt. You saying this is dangerous? She met his eyes. I'm saying you're not dealing with a sentimental man. If he left something behind, it's because he didn't expect to be around to explain it, or because he didn't want anyone else to. On the way back, I held the map like it might bleed. Back in Manhattan, Wolfe waited precisely 36 seconds after our return before dispatching us to the late Mr. Varney's townhouse. The library had been sealed since the banker's demise, and Kramer, badge in pocket, got us past the locks with grim efficiency. The room was a librarian's fantasy: floor-to-ceiling shelves, glass-topped cases, leather armchairs aged to a shine. But Wolfe had been specific. Third shelf, from the left, row of legal volumes, remove volumes, 14 through 20. I obeyed. Behind the gap where American commercial statutes once lived, the wood didn't match. Kramer leaned in, frowned, and ran a finger along the edge. It clicked. The panel eased forward. A hidden drawer revealed itself like a shy witness. Inside, an envelope, thick and sealed. Tucked beneath it, a note, handwritten in that same tight script. No greeting, no signature, just 5 words. For Wolfe, trust no duplicate. Kramer made a sound halfway between a growl and a curse. I nodded. Looks like the late Mr. Varney left his final move for the master of sedentary strategy. Wolfe took the envelope from me like it might combust if handled too casually. He slit it open with his ivory-handled blade and unfolded the pages with the reverence he usually reserves for foie gras. The will was brief, handwritten, and terrifying in its precision. No heirs, no apologies, no explanations. The document voided every previous testament, revoked all grants and legacies, and named a single recipient, a foundation whose only descriptor was its charter, to preserve the untold. Trusteeship, Nero Wolfe. I waited for him to blink. He didn't. I presume, he murmured, this is his final strategy, not inheritance, but intention. What kind of foundation preserves the untold? I asked. Wolfe looked at me, then past me. The kind, he said, that defines its success by silence. Kramer, seated in the red chair like it had insulted his mother, muttered something about the will being inadmissible. Wolfe ignored him. He was already reading the last line again, lips barely moving. Wolfe's voice was quiet, almost conversational, as he read the final sentence aloud. My estate is to be used to bury the truth. He folded the page and laid it on the desk like a body. There was a long pause. I could hear Fritz shifting a tray somewhere in the kitchen. Kramer said nothing. For once, he looked like a man who had stumbled into a play and couldn't find the script. Bury the truth, I repeated. That's poetic, also a little psychotic. Wolfe's lips twitched, just once. Not psychotic, prescriptive. He did not seek to expose deception, Mr. Goodwin. He sought to make it permanent. Kramer stood. I don't buy it. This whole thing, no heirs, no motive. It doesn't add up. Wolfe steepled his fingers. On the contrary, it adds perfectly. If his greatest asset was control, then the will is his final leverage. I looked down at the will again. The paper didn't tremble, but I felt like it should have. Not every man wants to be remembered, I said. Some just want to be unread. Wolfe's voice was the last sound in the room. And some, he said, prefer that their truths be embalmed. I hadn't seen Kramer that smug since the time he found a body before the coroner did. He didn't knock. He never does when he's gloating. He walked into Wolfe's office like he was about to accept a medal, which, knowing Kramer, wouldn't have been far from his actual expectations. She tried to flush it, he said, dropping into the red chair. The pen, down the toilet, gold-nibbed, engraved, and nearly lodged in the pipe. Took maintenance 30 minutes. Wolfe didn't blink. I presume the forged widow is now in legitimate custody. Booked and cuffed, Kramer said. Nice apartment. She had a wine rack and a wedding photo of someone else's wedding. I raised an eyebrow. Any tears? She asked if the cuffs clashed with her blouse. That earned a slight twitch from Wolfe, which is as close as we get to approval. Kramer stood and extended a hand across the desk. I'll deny this later, but good work. Wolfe took the hand as if it were a pressed orchid. Brief contact. No warmth, just acknowledgement. Justice, Wolfe said mildly, is rarely convenient, but sometimes it is punctual. Arraignment was the usual exercise in minimalism and marble. The forged widow, Miss Estelle Harlow as it turned out, wore handcuffs like accessories and smiled like a woman auditioning for a painting no one had commissioned. She didn't protest, didn't plead. Just stood there with that velvet, smoothed expression that belonged more in a salon than a courtroom. The DA read out the charges: fraud, perjury, conspiracy, the whole buffet. She nodded along, as if agreeing with a particularly thoughtful opera review. Her counsel, a man with the spine of a bookmark, requested a continuance. The judge, mercifully, had seen too many performances and granted it with a sigh. I watched her exit, flanked by officers, one heel catching slightly on the worn floor. She didn't flinch. There are women who cry when caught. There are those who faint, rage, or confess. Estelle Harlow simply exhaled, the way you do when the curtain comes down and there's no encore. I didn't envy the jury. She could sell sunlight to a lizard. The executor arrived that afternoon with an envelope thick enough to choke ethics. He wore a suit that said he played squash, not chess, and a face too smooth to trust. "I'm authorized," he said, "to offer a discretionary gratuity for Mr. Wolfe's efforts. Discreet, of course." Wolfe was seated, which, given the laws of physics, he always is. He didn't touch the envelope, didn't even lean toward it. "I do not traffic in discretion," he said. "I apply it." The executor chuckled, misreading the man by several kilometers. "Well, it's a handsome sum. Consider it a bonus for revealing what others might have buried." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Quid est veritas?" Pilate asked it. "I prefer not to answer for less than justice." I cleared my throat. "That means he's declining." Wolfe raised one eyebrow. "Precisely." The envelope remained on the desk, unopened and unwanted. The executor left with it. No handshake, no receipt. Wolfe's voice, low and final. "Even a counterfeit widow deserves a genuine refusal." That evening, at precisely 6 o'clock, Fritz brought in the beer. 2 glasses. No words, no flourish. Just the ritual. Wolfe took his glass without comment and leaned back, letting the foam settle while his eyes rested somewhere between the bookshelves and the ceiling. I watched him, knowing the silence was not absence. It was digestion. Of facts, of motives, of moral debris. He raised the glass, not quite toasting, not quite ignoring me. No Latin, no epigram. Just the faint creak of leather and the quietest of nods. "Don't all jump up at once," I said, lifting mine. "To widows, may they always come with paperwork." No response. Wolfe sipped, eyes still distant. I stretched my legs, enjoying the rare calm. Not the calm of victory. Wolfe didn't believe in such things, but the lull after the chessboard has been cleared and no pawns are left standing. Outside, the city kept breathing. Inside, the foam left a ring on the tray. It wasn't justice exactly, but it was cold, smooth, and hard-earned. Sometimes that's the closest thing we get. Later, as I went over my notes, I kept circling back to that signature, the one on the forged will. Elegant loops, correct margins, a flourish that could pass any eye but Wolfe's. It had everything but one thing: pulse. That's what Wolfe had spotted. Not the ink, but the absence, the difference between a signature and a sign of life. The forged widow had mirrored the same illusion. A life copied line by line, perfectly phrased, emotionally sterile. I've seen real widows. They don't smile at arraignment. They don't flush pens. They don't quote lines from property disputes like bedtime stories. A good forgery fools the eye. A perfect one fools the soul, until someone like Wolfe refuses to be moved. The signature had all the anatomy, spine, curve, conclusion. But it missed the shiver. Wolfe once told me that lies make noise only when they try to be quiet. This one had been a symphony of silence, and he'd heard every note. The clock struck 7. Wolfe rose, not fast, not slow, just final. He handed me a half-folded paper with notes in his neat, disdainful scrawl, for the files, of course, closure, if not comfort. Do not embellish, he warned. The facts require no accessories. Story of your life, I said. Fritz had already disappeared into the kitchen, chasing down a lamb ragout that had been murmured about since lunch. The scent of rosemary drifted in like a bribe. Wolfe turned toward the plant rooms. The orchids had waited patiently. They always did. Murder might disturb his schedule, but botany restored it. I stayed behind in the office, the beer glass still damp on the tray, and opened my notebook. Some people use routines to escape. Wolfe used them to anchor. The ritual of silence, the calculus of motive, the firm rejection of chaos by way of chairs, plants, and strict timetables. As I began writing, I realized I didn't feel tense anymore. Funny thing, murder. After a few years, it starts to feel more stable than most marriages. At least the lies have structure. I filed the report the way Wolfe liked it, chronological, tight, and without metaphors. But when I reached the final line, I paused. Estelle Harlow's smile had haunted the margins. That unbothered velvet smile she wore from arraignment to arrest. But a smile, no matter how rehearsed, is still a muscle. And muscles eventually get tired. The last time I saw her, during a transfer hearing, she smiled again. Only this time, it trembled. Not a lot, just enough to suggest the cracks. I ended the case file with a line that wouldn't make the legal briefs, but might help me sleep. Not every widow weeps for love, but every deception leaves a signature. Wolfe would hate the poetry of it. Fritz might nod. Me? I liked it. It fit. Because in the end, it wasn't the forged documents or false identities that gave her away. It was the performance. Too smooth, too clean, too certain. Real life, even in grief, stumbles, and Wolfe, damn him, always hears the trip. In the end, justice came quietly, without triumph, without applause. A forged widow, unmasked, a will unsealed, and a truth that refused to stay buried. Wolfe returned to his orchids, and I to my notes, both aware that deception, once uncovered, leaves a scent that never quite fades. But perhaps the deeper riddle isn't who lied, but why. Was it greed, loneliness, or simply the need to be someone else for a little while? What would you have done in Wolfe's place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.